The first video focused on the issue of the agency problem in public companies where owners and managers are separated. In the second video, we will now discuss the various mechanisms that shareholders can use to make sure that managers pursue shareholder interests and how they oversee the firm. There are two broad categories of corporate governance mechanisms. The first set of mechanisms are internal mechanisms, and these are specific structures involved within the firm that help oversee managers. You'll note here it says proxy statement in parentheses. All of these internal mechanisms there's a goal to be transparent by the Securities and Exchange Commission or the SEC, and so each year prior to the annual meeting, a public company must file what's called a proxy statement, and you can find information about these three mechanisms within that proxy statement so that you can see how the oversight of firms is occurring. The second set of mechanisms are external mechanisms, or mechanisms outside of the firm in the industry and government space, where these are designed to make sure management stays in check from the external side. Over the next few slides, we'll now delve into these in more detail. The first internal mechanism involves ownership concentration. Ownership concentration is the percentage of outstanding shares owned by a single owner. Higher concentration means that there's a higher percentage of shares in the hands of a few investors. In other words, 2 or 3 or maybe 4 investors own a significant proportion of the firm's shares. What this does is this places more power in the hands of fewer people. This ownership concentration has been increasing over time as more and more institutional investors have grown in the market, including mutual funds, private equity firms, hedge funds, etc. These large owners have incentives to monitor actively for two reasons. One, they have an ability through their large equity stake because they have a large number of votes, to influence managerial activity. And two, because they own such large proportions of the equity, it often represents a significant proportion of their wealth. Thus, they are more concerned than smaller shareholders about the managers taking actions that pursue growth in stock prices and follow shareholder interest. Thus, higher ownership concentration leads to more active monitoring and more shareholder power to oversee management. Executive compensation involves providing managers incentives to motivate them to take appropriate actions and decisions that follow shareholder desires. The key components of executive compensation are listed here. Salary involves the annual salary paid. Now, the greater proportion of salary paid actually increases risk aversion in managers because there's no benefit for them to take risk and put that salary at risk. So higher salary means greater risk aversion. Bonus is fairly similar in the sense that there is some incentive to take some risk, but once that bonus is achieved, it induces risk aversion, because now once that bonus has that target level has been achieved, managers will want to preserve that bonus. So there is some level of risk seeking followed by a level of risk aversion once achieved. Stock provides managers pay or compensation through shares of stock, and you can see here unrestricted versus restricted. Unrestricted means I simply pay them in shares of stock that they own as soon as it's given to them. Restricted shares of stock says I give them shares of stock, but they don't actually have access to that stock until 1 or 2 years later, or until several targets are met. Now, by making managers shareholders, they begin to think like shareholders, which should align their interests. However, by giving them stock, you have given them downside risk in the form of, if the stock price declines, managerial wealth declines. Thus, some small amount of stock pay actually encourages risk-taking and encourages them to think like shareholders. However, as that level of stock compensation increases, it actually increases the risk aversion, because more and more of the manager's wealth is tied up in stock. Therefore, they will try to make decisions that will not harm the stock price, rather than thinking about increasing the stock price. Stock options involve giving the managers an option to buy stock at a certain price, and what this does is it removes the downside risk associated with just simply shares of stock. So by providing stock options, you're providing them an opportunity to gain if the stock price goes up, and then think in terms of increasing stock price without the associated risk. And then the last one is the long-term incentive pay, where you are giving managers longer-term incentive targets, and if they reach those, they're given cash. So it's, instead of an annual bonus like the second component listed here, long-term incentive pay is like a multi-year bonus. Now you'll notice that these various incentives have different time horizons, they induce different risk preferences, they involve different risk-bearing levels for managers. As a result, shareholders will want to design a compensation package that will foster the appropriate level of risk seeking and to foster the correct behavior in managers that they're trying to obtain. However, sometimes these packages have unintended consequences, and I'll go back to the example of stock here. The idea of paying managers with stock is supposed to make them think like shareholders. However, if you give them too much stock, they actually become very risk averse, which is the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. In addition, some of these incentives may create the desire or the motivation to behave in legal or ethical gray areas, or even beyond there into unethical behavior in order to achieve incentive targets. And so shareholders have to be cautious here that they're not motivating the wrong behaviors when trying to actually incentivize correct behaviors. The final internal mechanism is the board of directors. Now, the board of directors are a set of individuals who are elected by the shareholders, and their job or their responsibility is to protect the interests of shareholders through the setting of compensation, as we just talked about, through advising the CEO and top management team, through working with reporting and managing the financial relationship with external auditors who oversee the validity of the financial statements, and by representing shareholder interests when the strategy is designed and proposed for a vote. Now, the board has several legal duties that they are required to uphold or that they are personally liable for. One is the duty of care, that they will basically understand the firm's business and make sure that they follow it. Second is the duty of loyalty, where they're supposed to act in the best interest of the corporation. And this is important because at times there may be a conflict of interest between the director's interests and the firm's interests, and therefore they must always choose the firm's interest at heart. And then there's the business judgment rule, where at a time the board is shielded from liability if they take reasonable actions on behalf of the firm that yield poor results. Essentially, the board of directors has a fiduciary responsibility to protect shareholder interests, and these duties here are the legal duties that they are held bound to. And if they fail in these duties, and if they're negligent or if they fail to follow these directors can be sued for not performing their activities to protect shareholder interests. The previous three mechanisms were internal mechanisms, or mechanisms that directly involve aspects of the firm's governance system. The external mechanisms listed here are outside of the firm, and these still offer oversight and control of management, but they tend to be more incurred, or they may happen when the firm is grossly undermanaged or poorly managed. The first one, the market for corporate control, essentially refers to the merger and acquisition market. Here, if firm management is not doing their job or doing their job poorly and the firm is underperforming, then that company may become a takeover target, and a purchaser or an acquirer will buy that firm because it's performing poorly, replace the ineffective management, and then turn it around and possibly sell it back out or spin it back out or hold on to it. But essentially you have this becoming more and more prevalent with activist investors taking stakes in firms and forcing change. A second external mechanism is government action, and this really only occurs when the firm has broken laws or has failed to comply with regulations. And so here you have several government bodies such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Internal Revenue Service, which oversee firms in terms of their following publicly traded firm guidelines, following environmental guidelines, and or following tax guidelines. And so the government will become involved if the firm violates any legal standards in their poor management decisions. But again, this is only an enforcement should something go wrong or look like it's going wrong. This is not necessarily going to be an ongoing oversight mechanism similar to the internal mechanisms. And then finally, you have a set of third-party corporate watchdogs, such as rating agencies and other governance rating companies. And these companies really are basically hired by investors. They're paid by investors in various forms to keep an eye on firms, and they rate firms and provide these ratings so that outside investors can see how the firm is operating from a governance perspective. Is the firm well structured? Is management doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are there issues in terms of the bylaws of the company or in terms of the management of the company that may put investors at risk? Thus, these external mechanisms help investors make sure management is acting in line with shareholder interests. And when combined with the internal mechanisms, provide a relatively comprehensive system to oversee public companies. However, it's important to note that even though this governance system exists, there's always unintended consequences, or there's always opportunities for firms to try to find loopholes or to try and find ways to get around these governance mechanisms to pursue self-interest. Thus, the system of corporate governance, particularly in the U.S., is a constantly evolving system involving changes in regulations, changes in behaviors, changes in investor activity to try and stay on top of management to pursue shareholder value maximization.